good morning, morena everybody. So welcome to our webinar on the law of ego, moving your business from craft to enterprise. I think all of you who are on the call will know who I am and who I work for. What you may or may not know is that I ran my own company for 20 years, and during that time I had the privilege of working with Carl and Sirdar, so some 14 odd years ago, when they had relatively recently started. So it came at a good time for us as we were looking at international expansion and needed guidance as to avoid some of the dangers that can happen, and actually to help us moving from that craft where we were a small company into growing to a bit more of a business environment. So it was really good timing for us. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Carl Bates to you, who's the founding partner at the Sirdar Group. Carl is a director and speaker and author, mentor and dynamic thought leader who founded Sirdar over 15 years ago. He has also recently become a dad of their second child, Logan, who came to join them with Angus, and he's married to Candace. They moved back to New Zealand 2 years ago, I think now, Carl, was it?
Yeah.
He's resumed a lot of his board appointments here. He's had more than 20 years experience as an independent chair and director of a variety of companies, and his experience ranges really from primary industries through to retail to professional services. With his directorship experience spanning a number of different countries since the age of 18 is when he started as a director. He has built a career specifically in the boardroom space. So he is also a published author, and he has spoken in nearly 25 countries on the topic of high performance boards. So on that note, I will hand over to you, Carl. Thank you very much for hosting this webinar for us.
Thanks so much, Sonia, and kia ora koutou, everyone. Welcome to this conversation, this discussion, this intriguing title, as Josh put it in the chat, around how you move from craft to enterprise. As Sonia's given a little bit of an introduction to me, and it's great to be a dad for the second time round, all going well on that front so far. I think it's really important to just contextualize the discussion we're going to be having today. Obviously, ultimately, it all relates to how boardrooms play a role in business success. And I think the important component of that, or the thing that I want you to take away at this point in the discussion, is that we come from, as Sirdar and as Skills Consulting Group, who are the exclusive offerers of the Sirdar services here in New Zealand, from the space of being in the boardroom. We work through educating, appointing and guiding boards of a range of companies across the globe, particularly though here in New Zealand, Australia, and in Africa, where we are the largest business in this space of guiding and developing boards, particularly of private and family businesses, but also of listed and government agencies. And I think when we talk about this idea of craft to enterprise, it's reassuring to know that the conversation, the insights are coming from people who are actually in the boardroom, who are directors, who are business owners, in inverted commas, and we'll talk a little bit about that idea of business owner as we go through the conversation this morning. If you've got any questions at any stage, please throw them in the chat. I am going to ask you a couple of questions at a few points to make sure that this is interactive and you get the value that you're looking for from the conversation, from the korero this morning. So the conversation comes from these two books, particularly the one on the right, The Laws of Extreme Business Success. And I'll reference very specifically the components of those books as we go through the discussion this morning. And at the end of the discussion, there is going to be a free gift that we have for you for having invested this time in getting this insight about craft or enterprise, and what that means for you or for your clients. And I know some of you aren't necessarily in business yourself, but do work with a range of businesses, family businesses, small businesses, what people might call small businesses, but I'm going to challenge you on some of that thinking this morning. And it may be that this gift is relevant for them. So to jump right in, I'm going to kick in with this question. Are you building a craft business or an enterprise? And really this idea of determining the game that you're wanting to play, and I'll talk a little bit more about a game in a moment, is at the crux of understanding what craft or enterprise means. I think too many business owners, too many small business owners go into business thinking that they are building a business, that they're creating a business, but in actual fact, the game they're playing is one of what we would call craftsmanship or craftswomanship, as opposed to this idea of enterprise. And I really want to create the distinction this morning for you between these two things, because unless we understand the game rules, how do we know how to win the game? And I think inherent in here sometimes is this idea or is this thought that, well, if I'm asking you the question, are you building a craft or an enterprise? Clearly, I think the idea of building an enterprise is better. Well, you can see that sun's just come out. Wonderful. We might have a bit of a warm day here. Clearly, I'm suggesting, or you might think I'm suggesting rather, that an enterprise is a better thing to do than craftsman or craftswomanship. And the reality is that's not necessarily true. It's really important for people who are in business to determine what game they're playing and ultimately which one is better for them financially. Because each of these games has a different set of game rules and therefore a different way of making money or ensuring that you've got enough money to ultimately retire on. And you can win really well at both of these games. Take, for example, one of my favorite examples in the context of craftsmanship is a lady by the name of Oprah Winfrey. She is a brilliant, brilliant craftswoman. She is the center of everything that she does. And if you take Oprah Winfrey out of Oprah Winfrey, there's no longer a game to be played. But at the same time, she's a very, very financially successful woman. So when we think about these two games, we need to understand what the financial choices are that come with them. So a craft fundamentally is about the idea that it's about you, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. And enterprise is about the idea that it's separate and distinct from you. And we'll interrogate or dig into that a little bit. They come also with financial choices. So craftsmanship is about this idea of maximizing your hourly rate, banking as much money as you can, and ensuring that the day you retire, you have enough money to retire on. Because the business inherently is in itself not able to be sold. Now, look, you're going to immediately argue, and if you're a business owner on the call, you're going to immediately go, but Carl, I've got stock, or I've got a van, or I've got a phone number that's got some value. And that may well be true, but at the core of it, those things aren't going to create enough money for you to retire on. And when we talk about retirement, I suppose I'm taking the nice option, because sometimes that decision can be forced by other things. It might not be retirement. It might be a health impact. You know, I know that 12 years ago, my dad had a major stroke. It was about a 9.5 on the Richter scale. And he today still struggles to talk properly and to walk. Now, he had a large plumbing firm that ultimately, as a result of that health impact in the middle of the GFC, and having run a business that was about him, that was driven on these rules of craftsmanship, didn't survive his time in the hospital. Now, that really, there's a whole lot we can dig into about that story and what happened and why. But at the core of it, it's just a reminder that this idea of having enough money to retire on is a placeholder for any of those life impacts, like you just get to the point where you decide you no longer want to be in business, that you want to do something else in life. It might be a health impact like my dad had. It might be that you've had to move, or you've had to sell the business because you've got to look after family or do something in a community context. There's a lot of reasons that the proverbial yellow bus, as I call it, comes along and takes you out. But the thing about craftsmanship is you've got to ensure that during the time you're involved in the craft, that you're banking that money. So you've got sufficient money to retire on, or whatever that happens to be, is when I refer to the proverbial yellow bus. The distinction is this idea of enterprise. And an enterprise is something that is separate and distinct from you, and it's about building something of value. But there are game rules that come with achieving that. And we'll talk a little bit about those as we move along. So I suppose the question for you this morning is, what game are you playing? And for those of you who are working with businesses, who are working with companies that may be grappling this question, the question for them is, what game are they playing? Are they playing the game of craftsmanship? Are they playing the game of entrepreneurship or enterprise? Or actually don't they really know, and that's part of the problem? So craftsmanship is an interesting idea, and it could make you think about business in a few different contexts. So what I'm going to do is give you a couple of different ways craftsmanship may show up in reality. Craftsmanship may show up in the context of being an artisan. You might still call yourself a small business owner. You might go along to the Chamber of Commerce events and say, yeah, I own a small business. But the reality is, your business is about your skill, your ability, your understanding, excuse me, about your ability to produce a product, sell that product, and retain your clientele. Now, this idea, interestingly enough, is not new. Has anyone read the book Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, or indeed watched the TV show? If you have, throw a comment in the chat box. Carl, I've watched the TV series, or I've read the book, or maybe even I've got no idea what you're talking about. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, but you're one of those people who, when you hear someone says about a great book they've read, you go, I'm going to buy that one and read it. Just be warned that the book is this thick. It's a novel. It's a great novel. But essentially, Pillars of the Earth tells the story of the building of a cathedral in the 14th, 15th century, or somewhere around there. And it's about the idea that this cathedral takes generations of artisans to build. And what happens in that story is the master craftsman is replaced by the craftsman, who's replaced by the apprentice, who's replaced by the lackey. And the idea there is that the lackey's the apprentice is the son, and the lackey's the grandson. And what happens is the grandson, the lackey, becomes the apprentice. And as time moves on, the apprentice becomes the craftsman. And as time moves on, the craftsman becomes the master craftsman. And what's in the center of the story is this idea, in my mind, that all of these different crafts, there's never more than 4 or 5 people on the team. And if you think about the way everything worked back then, everyone worked under patronage in Europe, under patronage of the nobility, the church, the crown, or the state. And what happened is you got your income as a master craftsman, whether you're a jeweler or a gamekeeper or a builder, from the crown, from the church, or from the state, and you shared it with your craftsmen, your apprentices, and your lackey, and the cycle continued. Interestingly enough, today here in New Zealand, the statistics are really similar. The most profitable businesses per employee are those that employ less than 5 people. Let me say that again. The most profitable businesses per employee are those that employ less than 5 people. Because there's this funny thing about being a craftsman, that we think that because we're a craftsman, let's say we're a builder, we know how to run a building firm. Or that because we're a plumber, we know how to run a plumbing firm. Or because we're an accountant, we know how to run an accounting firm. And clearly, those ideas at the core are flawed. And that's why what happens through this transition from being a craft to being an enterprise, if you don't understand you're changing a game, changing the type of game you're playing, that the game rules have to change, the way you play the game has to change in order to get a result. And so being an artisan is one example of being a craftsman or craftswoman. So for those of you who aren't in business yourself, what I'd like you to do is put into the chat box, just think of a company that fits this criteria that you're working with, or a person that fits that criteria that you're working with, and just say, you can call it Jane Doe or John Doe, so you're not sharing any names and causing us any privacy issues, but just indicate to me that you've got in mind someone who fits that bill. Another example, and these pictures come from South Africa, where I've spent quite a bit of time over the years, trade and micro enterprises. Now, down in the corner, there is literally a photo from around the corner, I think from around the corner from our house, where we lived in Johannesburg. And if you came out of the equivalent of Mitre 10 there, and you drove out of Mitre 10 with your jib board, assuming you could get it, or your pipes that you needed to put in, or the new tiles that you wanted to put into the bathroom, you'd pick up some guys from the corner and hope that they had the skills that are illustrated on the sign. In a New Zealand context, so this is really similar. There's trade and micro businesses where there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 man and woman bands. And then you've got things like GPs. Many GPs are really a trade or micro enterprise. Yes, they've built a practice and they might have a client list that they can sell ultimately, but it's not what we would call an enterprise. Then you might have some SMEs that are slightly more sophisticated, like a small architectural firm or design firm as an example, where there's, again, 1 or 2 people involved, there's some people on the team, it's a bit more professional in presentation, but at the core of it, it's still about the individual designer or architect skill, ability, etc. So what's the distinction about being a craftsman? The distinction about being a craftswoman is that it's about your own knowledge. It's about utilizing your knowledge in your craft, and it's about sharing your knowledge with your own team. And to put not too fine a point on it, and this probably deserves a slide in itself to put it in bold up in front of you, excuse me. In other words, it's ultimately about owning a job. Ultimately, it's about owning a job. Now, for many people, at this point in the conversation, this would get their backs up, so to speak, and cause some heated debate. The point I'm making, though, is not that owning a job is a bad thing. Is that by understanding that is the game that you're playing, you really can hone in on what the strategy is to be successful, i.e., bank as much money as you can and ensure you've got enough money to retire on the day you choose to retire, because the value of the business itself is going to be very limited to some either core assets or stock, or maybe a little bit for the value of the name or the brand. I'm going to sort of leave the idea of craftsman or craftswomanship at this point and sort of park this while we go on to, well, what is being an enterprise? What does being an enterprise look like? And what are the game rules to achieve it? Ultimately, it is a choice that businesses need to make in order to be successful. And so what does being an enterprise look like? Well, being an enterprise looks like this, where they clearly make something. There's machinery, there's an output. And whether the shareholder is John or Jane or a listed company hasn't got any impact or little impact on actually what is produced in the factory itself. Another example of an enterprise might be private schools in some countries, where you've got a business that's not about any individual. It's not about the teacher's skill or ability. Obviously, it is in terms of reputation for that business. But it's not the teacher who owns and runs and then has to sell, ultimately, that enterprise. I suppose in a New Zealand context, an example of this is early childhood education. We had a situation where our son Angus at Christmas was going to a early childhood education centre in a small town here in New Zealand. The owner decided after 30 odd years of running this herself, she wanted to sell out. It was game over. Couldn't sell. Ultimately, the building that she'd been running in it sold, and that was the value that she got for her business, because the business itself was closed down and we all had to find other early childhood education for our children. And I think that that's a little bit scary. Now, well done to her for getting value out of that and being able to own the building and go through the growth and value that property has had here in New Zealand over the last few years. But isn't it a little bit scary to think that someone who probably thought for a long time that their business was worth something actually ultimately found that the value of the building was what the business was worth? So if you're talking with a business, or if you are a business on this call thinking about, am I a craft or am I an enterprise? Let me give you a couple of definitions that will help you understand this critical distinction. The first principle is an enterprise must be able to operate without the immediate involvement of the founder on a day-to-day basis. So just think about that for a moment. The enterprise must be able to operate without the immediate involvement of the founder on a day-to-day basis. If you're building a business, and I saw the mention of eMyth a little bit earlier in the chat, and to a large degree, there are crossovers in these ideas, but we're talking, I suppose, at the moment around not the system to run, which I support. I'm big on systems and running successful businesses. I'm talking a little bit more about the ownership structure and the thinking, how you structure the governance of an organization in order to get these outcomes. And so the first principle is that the enterprise must be able to operate without the immediate involvement of the founder on a day-to-day basis. If your craft business is based on you, you're failing this first principle. That doesn't mean you can't go on the journey of creating enterprise, but it does mean you have to commit to saying, I want to be an enterprise, and therefore I have to solve this problem. There's a excuse me. There's a couple of comments going on in the chat, and the one here about linking ownership to jobs raises the stakes in one's respect, but that also creates purpose and motivation. To some degree, Josh, I get that, but I think what it also does is it creates a heightened emotional engagement between the person and the business, which isn't necessarily always positive. And I think sometimes we wallpaper over the cracks in that idea. We talk with business owners about how it's great that they are their business as a good thing, and we ignore the bad things. What do I mean by that? One of the challenges with making your business about you is thinking about the newborns, right? Now, my wife and I are quite lucky. We're not possessive parents, might be the framing. We quite happily will leave Angus with someone for the day or for the evening or for the night or for the weekend, whether it be a family member or a close friend, or, we're a little bit sort of lax, probably too lax in that regard. But for many parents, and thinking about this in the context of a newborn, which we obviously have, getting someone to babysit your baby for the first time is really difficult, because there's this emotional connection. And in business, it's actually very similar. If you've built your business about you, if you've made it so you own a job, so that you're so central to the success of that business, what happens when you're not there? What happens when the proverbial yellow bus hits you and it's game over? And I think that's a little bit of what I challenge business owners to think about, in this journey and in this decision making. So the second principle is that an enterprise must have its own significant value and potential, and that it can continue to grow and develop that value despite the non-involvement, death, or retirement of the founder. If you think about when someone's looking to buy a business from you, what they're looking to buy is they're looking to buy potential. They're looking to buy not only what you've done, the history, but they want to know that there's a future. They want to know that it's going somewhere. And so businesses that are true enterprises are ones that have solved the question and been able to demonstrate and can demonstrate that there'll be ongoing growth and development in value despite the non-involvement, the death, or the retirement of the founder. So what does, why is that not working for me? At the core of this is accepting this idea that if you are in business, if you own a company, an enterprise, accepting this idea that it has nothing to do with you. Now, that's deliberately confrontational and deliberately challenging. And it's challenging because the idea of enterprise is based on a French word, entreprendre. And entreprendre means to promise or to undertake a promise. And so we're going to talk a little bit further down about this idea of enterprise and what enterprise means in the context of having a promise or a vision. At the core of it, it's all about the team. It's all about accepting that the game rules are different, that there is a separation and a distinction from you. And what that requires is shareholders, directors, and obviously the right managers. And I think here in New Zealand, too many of us put all of those hats together and we wear them as one and we go, I'm a small business owner. It's my business. I get to do this because I own the company. And what I would challenge you to think about for your clients, and I challenge those of you who are in business to think about, is when you walk into the Chamber of Commerce event and say, I'm a small business owner, or when you say to someone on your team, it's my business, therefore, my suggestion to you is that actually what you're saying is, I'm a small business, I'm playing by the game rules of small business, and that's actually what's going to keep me small. Saying to people that you're a small business, saying that you're a small business owner is at the core of part of the challenge of what's keeping you small and keeping you from recognizing this distinction. So in the Laws of Extreme Business Success, that one of those first two books I showed you at the beginning, we talk about this idea that an enterprise is a business with a promise and a structure that makes it sustainable beyond the person or people who founded or operate it. Excuse me. And that's really at the core of this idea of enterprise, this recognition that there are these three hats of shareholder, director, and manager, and understanding the importance of wearing each hat. I find it quite funny, actually, when we talk about this idea of shareholder and directors, and we talk to people and they say, oh no, I'm the only director of my business. It's my business. It's funny in a couple of ways. First of all, it's funny because the Companies Act here in New Zealand says every business is governed by a board of directors, plural, not singular. But we also allow a business to have one director in the Companies Act. And we allow that, I think, more for structuring and tax than we do because it actually represents the core idea of what an enterprise is all about. I also find it funny
Because if you for a moment were thinking that you weren't here in a webinar about business success, about moving from craft to enterprise, if you for a moment thought about the fact that maybe you were here at a shareholder AGM, and I am presenting to you as the chief executive, as the director, as the chairman of the board, as the manager, as the only shareholder other than you. And I said, everyone, I'm the only director accountable and responsible for the success of this organization, and I'm the only person managing the business. I'm the chief executive and I'm the director. But all of you were shareholders in this business. How comfortable would you feel right now? And when I ask that question in a room full of people, the hands go up and people go, not very. Because we inherently know that a business governed by a board of directors is core to what creates and makes successful businesses. So why is it any different in a business that you own or that you run, or that it's only you that's in? So with that sort of thought in mind, I'll share with you an example of a great business in South Africa that we've been working with. I really like this because of the context of stuff going on here in New Zealand at the moment as well. This company is called the People's Fund, and it works with Black entrepreneurs to pull them into the supply chain, or provide them the opportunity to step into the supply chain, to the procurement journey for government and for corporate, as part of empowering Black entrepreneurs in South Africa. It would be a model that would work in supporting Māori and Pacifica, as an example, to get into supply chain, businesses into the supply chain of government and corporate here in New Zealand, by providing them the funding they require to transact that, which is the core of the idea of the People's Fund. Now, when Sirdar came along and started helping them understand this difference between the idea of a craft and an enterprise, that happened by setting up some formality around the boardroom table, creating a distinction between the shareholders, the guys and the girls who had come up with the idea, the management who were implementing it, which included a couple of the founders, and the board that brought some independence, including independent directors, to enable the business to go on a journey of creating some real success. And it's grown from a $1 million business to a $25 million odd business in a couple of years. It's a huge growth, very successful, in the context of making that decision from moving from craft to enterprise. And at the core of the making of that decision was understanding the distinction between these three things: the shareholder, the board, and the management. And the thing here is the shareholders have a relationship from the company. Shareholders are shareholders in the company. They get input from the company. They have the ability to set expectations around things like dividends and appointment of directors, but they don't actually have operational control. How many times have you heard in a business a shareholder say, "It's my business, therefore I can"? Well, actually, that's not true. The decisions you make around running the company come from the board. And if you're the only director, they come from you as the director, but they don't come from you as the shareholder. So often in business, we hear business owners say, "It's my money, therefore I'll make the call. I'm the one at risk." Well, actually, as the shareholder, you're not at risk. Well, you are at risk, but you're at risk in the context of limited liability. That's the whole structure on which the Companies Act here in New Zealand is built. You have limitation on your liability. The liability, more and more so as successive governments make it more challenging to be a director, the unlimited liability sits around the boardroom table as directors. And then management have a two-way relationship, which often is about power and control issues between the management and the company. And what happens, particularly if there are a couple of shareholders who are also involved in the management, some of you will have clients where there'll be two shareholders who are also the two core managers in the business. What happens is when there's an argument, it's just like heat. Heat rises to the top. When there's an argument, it rises to the highest common denominator, their role as shareholders. I'm a shareholder in this business, therefore you can't. It's my company, therefore you're not going to do this or that to me. It's my business, or I invested in this business too, so we are going to. And the operational issues, they fall like water to the lowest common denominator, the role of management. So when they're sitting around the table and they're talking about how to improve profitability, all of a sudden we start talking about how John on the reception desk doesn't answer the phone properly, or Jane, who runs that big machine, could be doing better. The whole role of the board in the middle there is to create the separation between the shareholders and the managers, and recognize that the only party that has one role, which is guiding the company itself, is the board. And it's important that that board therefore has independent non-executive directors. So this idea comes from the laws of extreme business success, the law of three hats, and it talks about these three roles in the context that shareholders invest for return, directors are there to champion the promise, they're there to ensure the company delivers, and managers are there to bring the promise to life. And so in order to be really successful about this idea of enterprise, the second principle was knowing that there's a future, knowing that there's something bigger than whether or not you are there as the founder or, inverted commas, as the owner. And this relates to this idea of where are you going? And this is about asking the question of what is the promise? What is the vision? What is the mission? Now, I've kept this really simple in a slide without lovely colors and pictures and all of the jazz, because I think we can overdo these conversations sometimes. A lot of the time we get caught up in massive strategy documents, and we talk about, for small businesses and enterprises in New Zealand, what's the business plan and all this stuff. And I remember, ironically, the same business that my dad had that went under when he had his stroke. A few years earlier, he had won the business awards in Wanganui, and his business plan, and so this is not necessarily the best advertorial for doing business plans on a picture, but he had won the business awards in Wanganui, and his strategic plan was a painted picture because he loved painting. What a brilliant way to create a visual for your strategy. Now, interestingly enough, the book, my go-to book on strategy in small and private companies, is a book called Scaling Up, and it talks about the idea of putting your vision onto a picture each quarter and putting those posters around the office, around the team, putting them as desktop images. And so unlike in that period where Dad won the Wanganui Business Awards, we now do that in our businesses as well, and we create that visual and we set that up. And in one of our companies, it's a personality profiling model. The manager there, Karen, she actually frames the picture and puts it on the wall of all of the team to create that focus. So that's a little bit more of a side road on the idea of creating visuals around your strategy. At the core of that, though, and at the core of this definition you've got to be able to tick the box on in order to be an enterprise, is what's the reason bigger than you for the existence of the organization. Now, at Sirdar, it's about creating meaningful economic impact. And I would like to think, and I certainly have the evidence to support this, that if I got run over by a bus today, our business tomorrow would continue to grow and to continue to have the impact that we have in the countries and in the places we work, because our team have bought into that vision of creating or meaningful economic impact. What's the vision? What's the, even more important than that, what is the promise in your organization? What's the promise in your client's business? Because it's that promise that makes someone else want to step up to the plate and take the organization forward. And I like the great examples of the likes of Disney creating magic, or Virgin being the champion for the consumer. You know, Richard Branson and Virgin have never created a product in their life. They've taken on markets, and it's probably a bit unfair to say never created a product in their life, but certainly Virgin's games that they've gone into, their strategy for many years was about going into industries that had big players, that had monopolies or duopolies or big organizations that they felt they could produce a similar quality product at a better price point for the consumer. It was about being the champion for the consumer. Disney, about creating magic, whether it be in the movie theater, in Disneyland itself, on a cruise ship. And I could talk around this idea of promise and help really understand it a lot more. But for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to pause there before I get too carried away with this idea of promise, because I think it's so powerful to the success of business. And maybe there's an opportunity, Sonia, there for a webinar for us all about the idea just of promise and how important it is for business. Ultimately, this discussion today is about making a choice. Craft or enterprise. As a craftsman or a craftswoman, do you want to go on the journey of climbing solo and the risk and the reward that can come with that? Or do you want to go on the journey of climbing as a team, building a business that is more important or bigger than you, that when you decide to retire has value in and of itself, something that is saleable, something that can be passed on, sold on, and ultimately something that if you get hit by the proverbial yellow bus, or your client gets hit by the proverbial yellow bus, isn't going to fall over because you are no longer, or they are no longer there. Now, before I share or ask you for your biggest takeaway from today, and before I share with you that free gift that I promised, what I wanted to do was just check in and see if anyone had a question, a key question that you wanted to ask me at this stage about this idea of craft versus enterprise. And if you do, please throw it into the chat. Anyone have a key question? Josh says, can your products be craft, but your organization behave like an enterprise? It's a really insightful question, Josh. And the way I'd answer it is this. Every organization has craftspeople in it. Whether you're a school with teachers, or a plumbing firm with plumbers, or a building firm with builders, or a software company with software development or software technicians or engineers. Every business has craftspeople in it. The question is, are you at the helm of it playing the game of craftsman or craftsmanship, or are you playing the game of enterprise? So the short answer is all products are in some form a craft, because they're created by someone who understands that craft. We might not always think about it like that. For example, take McDonald's, the craft of making the burger. There's a particular way to make the burger, and you've got to be trained to do it. So every business has craftspeople in it. Different industries will have different views of what the skill level needs to be in order to be someone who's considered a craftsperson in that industry. I suppose at the other end of my career, so McDonald's at one end, to become a crew trainer was a process, but it's about making burgers. And I suppose from there, I went on to become a chartered accountant, and that's a whole lot more work in order to achieve that crafts status. Hope that answers your question. Jude asks, how do you convince small businesses to move to enterprise? So really good question. And I think part of it is to, first of all, not suggest that enterprise is the better outcome. So part of it might be understanding what game they want to play. They might be comfortable being a craftsman or a craftswoman, but then they've got to understand that, for example, 5 people is the maximum people you want on your team, because the stats show that as you start going above that, you start doing things that require things like cash flow management and HR management and profitability management and project management and all of these different things in a different way to when your business is just you. So in making the decision, if you are going to say a craft, work out what the game rules mean in your industry in order for you to be successful and set goals that relate to that. If you are wanting to move to an enterprise, and then I suppose related to your second point, how do you convince them to enter a different governance structure when they're small? Two different ways of thinking about this. One is exposure to thinking. I suppose you don't know what you don't know, and often you don't know that you don't know what you don't know. So it's about creating exposure to the stuff. I tend to be fairly blunt about it. You know, I ask business owners who are directors of their companies, have they ever learned anything about what it means to be a director? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. You know, like my dad, he became a director and was a director of his business for 30 years. And sometimes I joke with him that he had sort of some thought that through divine intervention on the day he signed the form to become a director, he found out what it means to be a director. If you're a director of your business and all you are is a director, that sounds really bad. Your experience of being a director is being a director of your own company. You don't understand what it means to be a director. You might run a good business. You might be making money. You might have a great team. But I would challenge someone who's only ever been a director of their business, their own business, to give me the distinction between when they're wearing the hat of being the chief executive of the business and when they're wearing the hat of having a board meeting or being a director. And the reality is that distinction doesn't happen. So, as I say, I'm fairly blunt with the way I challenge people on this idea. I think the other thing that I ask them is that question around, have they ever done the training, the divine intervention idea? I think that challenges people about, well, do I actually know what being a director is all about? And then the last thing that I do is I share with them the success stories. And the success stories are not just ours, but the ones you know globally. And the point with those success stories is a little bit like climbing the mountain on the screen there. And if we contextualize this to climbing Mount Ruapehu or climbing the Tongariro crossing here in New Zealand, when you do the Tongariro crossing, do you wear your jandals until you get to the top of the saddle and then put on your climbing boots? Because now you've got there, you've achieved it. And once you're on the saddle, you put on your proper climbing boots, and then because you're on the saddle, you put on your warm clothes and then climb down? No. Before we go on that, we know we have to prepare. We do a little bit of training. We get our climbing boots. We get the right backpack. We make sure we've got our water. We have the right clothes on. And okay, as we traverse it, as we get higher, we might have to put more warm clothes on. But we don't just wear our jandals until we reach the summit. And I think many business owners, in inverted commas, approach this like they approach climbing a mountain, approach their business and having a board like they approach climbing a mountain in that example of the jandals, where they think, I'll get a board when I get there. I'll get some independent help when I get there. I can't afford it now. It's not the right time for me now. And I think that the evidence overwhelmingly shows, you know, the academic research about success of family businesses, success of private companies, succession planning, the transition, all point to having boards and independent directors. So thanks, Jude. Hope that answers the question and gives you some good context. Conscious of time, if there's one last question, I'll take it. Otherwise, I'm going to move to, and I'd like everyone to put into the chat box, what was your biggest takeaway today? What was your biggest takeaway today? Put into the chat box, what's been your biggest takeaway today? Give it a moment for those to come through. What has been your biggest takeaway today? Josh says, it's nothing to do with you. Awesome. Any other key takeaways from today? Sometimes it takes them a moment to come through, particularly if you're still thinking about them as you're typing them through. Probably just what I've answered. Awesome. Agree with Josh. Awesome. Okay. Well, we'll leave those there, and I will share with you. I promised you our free gift. Our free gift is a book called, or an ebook called, The 4 Dangers That Kill Businesses and Destroy Value. So we'll send that link out to you. It might be something that you find really valuable for your businesses, for those that you work with, who you're thinking about, as we've been talking today, that you've referenced and you've thought, oh, you know, Turama over there or Johnny has this challenge, and you can flick them this ebook and they'll get some real value to start challenging some of their thinking. So just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Hope that you got some real value out of that conversation, and don't know why that's done that. Got some real value out of that conversation. There we go. The law of ego, moving from craft to enterprise. Hope you got some real value out of that. That gave you some good insight, and look forward to seeing you on one of our webinars here with Skills Consulting Group in New Zealand again soon.
Thank you very much, Carl. We really appreciate your time on this, and as always, incredibly insightful webinar from you. And you know, you just make things that we can tend to overcomplicate. You just manage to make them seem quite simple and very clear. So we really appreciate your insights, and thank you very much for your time again.
No worries at all. Thanks so much, everyone.
Right. Bye, everybody.